So we're talking about the challenges and the conflict in Australia and New Zealand. This is the last part of the history lesson. As humans from other parts of the world moved to Australia, they brought other animals in order to have like ranches. But how was ranches having a good effect and a bad effect? Both positive and negative effects on the life in Australia. Who can tell me? The negative and the positive effects of having ranches or bringing animals from across the world to Australia. Who knows? Laura, go ahead.
Hello, Miss.
Yes, Laura, I can hear you.
Okay. Um, they ate too much grass,
Mhm.
and there was no more grass left. And the rabbits, they became there are many rabbits into 1 billion, and that's all I know.
Okay,
I
let's
can't
start
remember.
from the beginning. We said that ranchers brought dogs for guarding and herding sheep. Also, wealthy landowners imported European rabbits, as Laura mentioned, to hunt or for sport. And also, in an effort to get rid of sugar cane fields of destructive beetle, farmers brought in huge poisonous cane toads. So they brought two main things. They brought the rabbits and they brought the cane toads. So what? So this was the positive effect. They wanted to have better life there by bringing the cane toad in order to get rid of the beetle, and by bringing the rabbits to and the dogs in order to protect the sheep and for to have other animal species. This has caused major problems. What were the major problems? Who can tell me? These often are called the introduced species, but what were the problems? What were the problems? Adam Sadat.
What were the problems for air recession?
For just I was explaining the Adham.
What?
I was explaining that they have brought rabbits, dogs, and cane toads.
Yeah.
What was the problems بقى?
Okay, 1 second. That rabbits. Okay, 1 second. A lot of rabbits, grass, and many wildflowers were left bare. Also, the numbers of cane toads multiplied, which made the killing native animal species in Australia crowded and a lot. But the animals that were new to the area, yeah, were called the introduced species.
Yes, these are called the introduced species. So it was impossible to estimate or calculate how much damage have been done to Australia's environment by but others continue to cause problems for humans and native animals. So this was a problem when they have brought the introduced species such as the rabbits and the um, cane toads. They have been multiplying and populating, which led to eating all the grass and killing most of the native animals. Then the British settlers built their homes and farms all over Australia, often forcing Aboriginal people to work. So, what was the reaction of the Aboriginal people? Is it only Laura, guys? Hmm. Who else? Hannah Yasser?
Most of the Aboriginal people were forced to leave their land, and thousands of them, of the Aboriginal families and tribes, yes, they were forced to leave their land, although they had been there for um, like generations,
Yes.
and also European diseases and violence steadily they uh, deducted or made the Aboriginal population lessen,
Mhm.
and the survivors they had no choice but to live on rugged lands that European settlers did not want,
Yes, thank you, Rana.
because like when the European settlers, their land was like most fertile because they had been living there, um and making it more hello. Hello,
Yes.
hello. Yes, sorry, my internet cut off suddenly. They are making it more better because like they had been farming there and living there, so they're making it better for living for living as for a living environment. But because they were the only people there, like from many years ago, there were other lands that were in uninhabited.
Mhm.
So when the European settlers came, they took over the land of the Aboriginal people, and the Aboriginal people had to go live where they were for in foreign lands.
So when the British settlers built their homes and farms all over Australia, they have forced native people or the Aboriginal people to leave their lands. Okay, which has a very bad effect because they were left, most of them has died from the European diseases, and the left ones of them has left their land which they have lived in for generations, and they were forced to live in rugged lands, not the fertile soil. Let's talk back to the second part, let's move to the second part, the British and New Zealand. Who can tell me who discovered New Zealand and what was the situation there? Yes, yeah, Laura?
Yes, miss. So Captain Crook, he explored the islands, and while exploring the islands, he found that the fertile islands, they are valuable to the natural resources, and it can be good to colonize them. And then the British colonists, they
Yeah.
built settlements on the North Island.
Yes. So when Thomas Cook found that the land is very fertile and full of resources, he has set the goal in order to make the British settle down there. So the British government ruled especially the North Islands, was ruled by Queen Victoria and convinced that the Maori leaders to sign the Treaty of Waitangi, which is a treaty that gave legal Zealand to Great Britain, but it's guaranteed the protection and certain land rights for the Maori, but actually it wasn't fair for them. Yeah, they would be protected by the British in order to give them their lands. Also, other Europeans started to arrive to New Zealand, and they saw more and more of land taken by foreign settlers. So, sorry. So the society ways of life weakened when the British settlers brought new methods of farming, features, and other things. Okay, so as happened in Australia, happened also in New Zealand because they were like having new way of life, new businesses, new industries, farms, sheep ranches were built across the New Zealand. Sheep ranches make for livestock introduce species such as rabbits, goats, pigs, deer, rodents, feral cats began destroying the natural habitat, and they killed many native animals and threatened the survival of the entire species. So again, who can summarize what happened in New Zealand? How was it colonized by Britain? And what's the effect of the new techniques that was brought there? Hannah Hani, let's start. How was New Zealand colonized?
Yes, by Captain Cook. Captain Cook went to New Zealand and
Mhm.
found reported to the British that they had fertile soil, so they can colonize the country,
Mhm.
and um, they started to colonize the North Island of New Zealand until Queen Victoria quenced the Maoris to sign the Treaty of Waitangi.
Mm.
This treaty had guaranteed protection and certain land rights to the Maori.
Yes, thank you, Hannah, very much. How did the Europeans arriving has affected New Zealand? Um, okay,
Ahmed Magdi want to enter the
on the
meeting.
meeting, okay. Farah Hashim, can you tell me how did it affect? How was the European arrival affect the area there? Farah Hashim,
Sally, what was the question again?
how was the European arrival affected the place there? يعني when the European continued to arrive, what happened there? Farah, hmm? Is Farah Hashim here? Farah Mahlab,
Yes.
can you tell me
Um,
how did it been affect?
yes, when European arrived, the Morai saw their land being taken by the foreigners, and the Morai societies and life and way of life weakened when the British settlers brought new methods of farming and other features of culture.
Hmm.
And the conflicts between the Morai and British continued for a long time. And when many Morai were killed and they lost most of their land.
Yes,
Miss Sally,
yes,
Farah is telling you that she can't hear you. Farah Hashim.
okay, no problem.
Okay.
I'm admitting Ahmed Mahdi, but he keeps leaving the meeting. I guess he has an internet problem. Okay, Uta, can you tell me again what was happening in Australia businesses industries? Ahmed Uta.
Yes, miss.
Mm. Tell me what happened when the Europeans settled down there.
Uh, in New Zealand,
Yes, in New Zealand.
they began to remove all of the forests and start ranching and introduced new species such as rabbits, goats, pigs, deers, and destroyed the natural habitats of the animals, the original animals.
Yes. Thank you. Let's move back to the independent countries. Let's move to the independent countries. How did the British colonists set up in Australia took action to unify as a federation? So the six British colonies set up in Australia took action to unify in order to be unified. So who can tell me the story behind the unification and how did they get independent? Hannah Yasser?
This unification, it unified the it was an alliance that unified the countries of New South Wales, Queensland, Northern Territory, Western Australia, South Australia, and Tasmania. They were, the countries before them, uh, they made up the Commonwealth wealth of Australia, um, or Australia's wealth and money of the government, and um,
It was called
these
a
new
Dominion, but how was the
yeah
ruling system there?
the ruling the ruling system was government sorry. It was like Canada. They made it like Canada.
Yes,
They had a government that blended the U.S. style federal system with the British style parliamentary democracy. Through the 1800s, uh, people of New Zealand um, demanded independence from Great Britain.
hmm,
Then in 1852, the New Zealand Constitution Act recognized those local governments in the six provinces. But New Zealand, uh, the, New Zealand wasn't going to gain independence until very later, which means lots of time will be there before it gains its independence from Great Britain. In 1907, um, the British government uh, made finally gave New Zealand its independence and named it as an independent dominion with a British style democracy. But um, but even before New Zealand gained its independence, it made lots of political advances. Going back to 1893, with its political advances, it was the first country in the whole world to uh, legally recognize the vote, the women's right to vote.
Thank you, Hannah, very much.
Thank you.
So again, let me summarize this part again. So, as independent countries, we said that the Britain has set 6 colonies in Australia. So they needed to unify these 6 colonies under something called the Federation. So the action formed a political alliance between the New South Wales, Queensland, Northern Territory, Western Australia, South Australia, and Tasmania. The former colonies set up something called the Commonwealth of Australia. Okay, so these 6 settlements were unified under one dominion, which was called the Commonwealth. And this Commonwealth was self-governing, like Canada. You know that Canada is divided into provinces, but each province has its own government. It was the same. They were unified under a dominion, but they were self-governing. Okay, each settlement has its own government. Okay, so they had like combination between blended U.S. style federal system and British style parliamentary democracy. So they had like the parliament, and at the same time, they had the federal system. Then the residents of New Zealand have pushed the independence from Great Britain. They have started to, they wanted to gain their independence from Great Britain, and they made their own constitution and act recognized that local governments in the 6 provinces and the British government named New Zealand an independent dominion. So they were trying to get their independence, and they did something called the Constitution Act, which recognized the local governments in the 6 provinces. So the Constitution Act, its job was to recognize the job of the constitution, or to recognize the government, and to say that each settlement has its own government. It has the right to govern itself away from the British ruling. Okay, then they named New Zealand an independent dominion, but with British style parliamentary democracy. Even before the independence, New Zealand had made a number of political advances, which became the first country in the world to legally recognize the
Hussein,
women's right to vote. Yes?
can you let Selma in?
Okay, I will let her in. So, how did New Zealand get its independence? How did New Zealand get its independence? It started by forming the one dominion of the Commonwealth. The dominion gave them its right to have their own government. Then the government was a mixture between the US style federal and the British parliamentary democracy. Then they have started to push the independence from the Great Britain. But at the end, after something called the Constitution Act, the local governments in the 6 provinces were recognized, and they get their independence at the end, and they were one of the most leading countries. They have all the first countries in the world to legally recognize women's right to vote. So who can tell me how did they get their independence? Okay, Mihat.
Through the 1800s, New Zealand pushed independence from Great Britain, and they made the Constitution Act,
Yes.
which recognized the local governments in the 6 provinces. provinces, but New Zealand was still a long way from independence. But in 1907, the British government named New Zealand an independent dominion with a British-style parliamentary democracy. Then New Zealand had made a number of political advances. In 1893, it became the first country to legally recognize women's right to vote.
Thank you, Amihad, very much. So we're going to be moving to the last part of the lesson, which is the region in the contemporary times, the new times. Australia and New Zealand were built into World War One and World War Two through their ties to Great Britain. But during World War Two, Australia and New Zealand and the US soldiers fought together in the Pacific region, and the alliance created closer ties among the three countries. So, because of the World War II and because of Australia, New Zealand, and US fighting together, they have made close ties together. But after World War II, Australia became completely independent, and Australia loosened ties with Britain and established closer ties to the US, which they have made them sign a mutual security treaty called the ANZUS, or the AN, and it means Australia, New Zealand, US. This is the name of the treaty. Okay, among the three countries in case of military threats in the Pacific region. So this treaty is about when you have any kind of threat among the three countries in the Pacific region, they will be able to protect each other. But in recent years, a huge increase in Asian immigration had led to more diversity in Australia and New Zealand. Today, more people are Asian background live in New Zealand than native Maori. The governments of both countries have also continued to address the Aboriginal and the Maori rights and the social concerns that the native people of Australia and New Zealand and their supporters continue to work for justice and equal rights under the law. So there are two things that are happening in the contemporary times. The first one was the US, and the second one, the increasing of the Asian immigration. Who can tell me the first one? How was the situation of the US and how did it develop? Bamika?
After World War One and Two, they had treaty ties with the Great Britain, and after World War Two, because Australia, New Zealand, and the US soldiers were fighting together, they became close. After World War Two, Australia became completely independent, and they loosened their ties with Britain, but they became closer to the United States and Asia. In 1951, Australia and New Zealand and United States signed a treaty called the ANZUS Pact. This treaty was a guaranteed protection and cooperation for all the three countries for military threats in the Pacific Ocean.
Yes, thank you very much. What about the situation in the recent years in about the Asian immigration? Mehi? Mehi?
Um, there was a huge increase in Asian immigration to Australia, so it became more diverse.
So today, يعني the area is more diverse with other more nationalities. Also, there were an effort which was paid to the Maori or the Aboriginal people. Why? They wanted what?
They wanted to the injustice and equal rights under the law.
Yes. Yes. These efforts are paid in order to have like justice and equal rights under the same law they're living in. Actually, guys, this is the end of the lesson and the session is about to end. What I want from you just to highlight something, you're going to reread the lesson, then create a timeline which has all the events in New Zealand and Australia. I want two different timelines, one for New Zealand and one for Australia with all the events, the historical events. You will write the name of the event with one line summary for the event, okay? I will be uploading the assignment inshallah today, and I will open for you the deadline to be like will have the whole week. so you can read the lesson carefully and do the deadline, the timeline. And inshallah, see you after vacation. Enjoy, have fun. I hope inshallah it will be a
Sally,
nice vacation. Yes,
I have a question.
go ahead.
Um, why did Australia broke ties with Britain and then they went to Australia and they went to US?
Okay, they broke ties with Britain because Britain was having like settlements. They were taking all the good things, the fertile soil and the products and the resources, leaving the Aboriginal people of Australia in a very rugged land and without anything. But when the Australians fought together with the United States, they found it like a friend. They will be protecting each other in the case of war. That's why they have يعني loosened their ties with the Britain and made close ties with US because it was not a settlement or a settler, it was like a friend. Okay,
Okay, thank you.
you're welcome. So, guys, anyone want to ask any question? More questions?
No, thank you, Miss Sally.
You're welcome. See you back after vacation. Enjoy. I wish, Yani, inshallah, it will be a nice vacation. You will be having fun.